Alrighty, so a little bit of time. I'm a little late because I had almost no food today. I had to eat before I got started. I'm still a little bit achy from not enough food today. My body doesn't like that. So I am trying to do the high protein diet right now. I did a couple of the days of protein bars. I did like a week and a half, I think, almost 2 weeks. Those don't do good things. They're candy bars. That's what they are. Anyway, so working on my script for, I guess we could call it a script for Nanowrimo. It's not really a script, but it is. I'm not sure what to call it. That's the big for me right now. As I've been playing with it, like I guess technically I'm what's called a Nanowrimo rebel, and that's partly because what I'm writing isn't a traditional book. So what I've been playing with here is the structure for what I'm going to call vestiges now. It's vestiges is the setting that I'm building. It's going to be a series of it's going to be a story that I write out to get a feel for how the overall adventure goes. But I'm also scripting it in a way so it is a novel that is bits of other novels that I have in the works in the background, but it's also a script for writing up a campaign world for tabletop game for a role-playing game. And if we're really good with it, it'll be the scripting needed to see if I can use RPG Maker to make this a playable video game. Because one of the things that was when you asked me if I write if I'm working on any novels, and I said yes. One of the other things that was mentioned was the tendency to have difficulty reading books, sticking with a book long enough for it to really, register. And so some of that, like, I feel like like the question I have for, I'm really all over the place today. The question I have about things like that is, are movies as difficult, or audiobooks? If listening or watching something is easier in that sense, there may be ways to enjoy some of the works that exist out there. Because, sitting and reading is not for everybody. And that doesn't mean you can't enjoy the same stories and settings. It's just there may be a better format. So like the book Ready Player One, they made a movie that was different in some aspects, but the movie's still good. They also have an audio book that you can listen to where somebody tells you the story of something. And I haven't heard that one, but I heard from some people that listened to the audiobook version that they enjoyed that. And it's much more closer to the actual written book. And I feel like if you have the option of a tabletop game version of Ready Player One and a video game of Ready Player One, which would be meta all the way. I mean, if you had all of those options, the option of what you can do with that story and the people you can reach that would miss one version and prefer another, like, I think that's a perfectly valid approach to making stories to share. This one happens to be hitting on a lot of those notches. Many of my other works, I think I will probably end up having, if I get any level of success with them, I will end up seeing if I can get them done as audiobooks. Specifically because I want the visually impaired to be able to enjoy some of my stories too, without having to resort to Braille because I think some of my works are going to be pretty long. All right, so audiobook books might be a little tricky. How about any? I don't know that a lot of fiction has ever made its way into being made into games that you can play. Like The Last of Us is a very linear story. And so in a sense, it's very much like a novel or a movie made into a video game. Like, you can fail in us. Connection failure. Are you kidding me? Why are you fighting me all the time lately? Yeah, so Last of Us is a very linear story. There's another game out there that's kind of deep and profound that is very kind of on rails. You're following it along, but you don't feel like you're being led around. I think it's like a beginner story or something like that. Anyway, so there are some games that are story games that have interactive elements along the path of the story that they're leading you on. So that's definitely a possibility of doing playable books. And I'd be curious to see if that's something that works for some people. But at any rate, the Vestiges story that I'm working on is, I do think I'm going to write it out as if I'm playing the game. And that's sort of what I'm working on. Like, instead of writing out things and setting up prompts and leaving blanks in the story for gameplay to happen in, cut it out, stop disconnecting. Instead of doing a segmented leads with space for players to interact with, I'm going to sort of set up the setting and play through it as I write it, and write it about my characters that I develop to play this game with. And then I will strip some of that out for the tabletop game version of it. And then I will see if I can construct a video of that that's playable. So I should be able to get a book, an audio book. I don't imagine I'll ever do a movie of this unless it's really popular. I might see if I can get some local actor friends of mine to do scenes from it. That could be kind of fun. And then tabletop game is really the big focus for me. I may release the story at some point, but it would spoil the tabletop game, I feel. And then I could see trying to bang out the video game by the end of the by early summer next year. I'm not going to commit myself to too much. I know I got too much going on my plate already. But what Vestiges is sort of like in mini books. It's sort of like what is it? The Lord of the Rings trilogy. Each of the big books is itself broken into smaller books. Like, I think there's a few other books that do that, where like book 1, book 2, book 3 inside a book. The individual books are really shorter, but the whole book is a little longer than most novels of their time were. So there's sort of like this trade-off. And what this is, it sets out with the very beginning with the main characters being lesser gods in a pantheon. And in the tabletop game, every player gets to design their own god that they get to play. And then we have a conflict among gods that happens. And in that conflict, your godly body is shattered. And so the little components that make up your body, I'm going back and forth about how I want to refer to this, because it is sort of like the God that you were died. And sort of like a phoenix, out of your ashes rises yourself again. You're reincarnating in a certain sense. But the person that gets reincarnated into the second chance at godhood is a segment of you, but with memories that are different from you when you were the full God. So it's, in a certain ways, this is the same one person, being, entity, but in another sense, it's sort of like a child of that being or entity. And so I'm not sure how to refer to it. And there are no guidelines for this kind of story, because I've never seen this kind of story before. So I have the idea of these characters who are gods that are destroyed, and the pieces of them sprout into a new being. In this case, it's almost like cloning a tree, where you take a cutting of a branch and a cutting of a root, and you graft them together, and you grow a clone of the tree. It's very similar to that. And so that first chapter of the conflict and the shattering and the falling down to earth is called Godfall. And there's some elements that are laid out in that story element about an overarching story of the conflict that led to that and the consequences of that battle. The other thing I'm going to play a little bit with is, in a lot of mythology, we have a tendency to have variance in time. So like a Rip Van Winkle, he goes into the fairy realm and he spends an evening feasting and dancing with them. And when he comes back out to the real world, it's 100 years since, and he's aged instantly as soon as he steps out. The other thing you see some of is the creation of the world in mythologies, where it takes 7 days to build the world, but the world took thousands of years to develop. And so the question of it's seven is 7,000 or 7 million years on Earth time. And you have a similar question of the very first humans in the Bible are oftentimes referred to as having lived to be 200 years old. And is that biblical time, or is that actual world time? How old was Adam and Eve, or were Adam and Eve when they died? And so the question, who's the one, Lot or Job, who lived to be the oldest man in record? So you have this variance of perception of time. Time is not always perceived in a same way from one aspect of the universe to another. And so I kind of want the breakout of the war in the divine realm to be something that happens, and 10 minutes of that time is 10 years on the surface of certain worlds. The worlds themselves, from world to world, time passes the same, but from the above world and the below worlds, it's a different sense of how time moves. And part of that should be in the story, because you're going to have this first inaugural battle that thrusts the godlings back down into the living realms. And when they land in the living realms, however long they were in that battle, which is probably going to be a few minutes to half an hour, is going to be showing signs of that battle on those worlds in sort of echoes, storms, catastrophes, natural disasters. These sort of situations are happening, but it's sort of like a hammer blow up here followed by a sword blow up here, takes place in all of 4 to 12 seconds. But down here, it's happening over the course of weeks. A volcano erupts, or a monsoon hits the coast, a tidal wave or a tsunami strikes one of the island nations. Those kinds of things are going to happen, but they're going to happen over months. But it's going to be minutes that they happen on the high side. And so what I want to happen on the course of those events is the characters that are thrust down to Earth, desperate to get to the high realm again and defend it and protect it and defeat the invaders. And in order to do that, you have to struggle on your world to assemble the things you need that'll get back up to the top level. And you may not get all of the pieces right away. You may have to shift between this world and this world to get, and then jump to this world. 3 different worlds give you all the pieces you need to make an attempt to go back up to the top level. And when you get there, it's going to take like 3 to 12 years to go through those worlds down here. But when you get back up there, it's going to be like maybe an hour or so has passed in the battle for the divine realm. And so there's an aspect of that I'm working on. And I talked last night, I think, about another time aspect that I want to be important is in the lower realms. I want the timeline to line up right so that as you travel through them, you get to the key and important aspects of those worlds. So I have several worlds here. And the first, I haven't really definitely established a sequence of them that we're going to pass through, but roughly what I'm working with right now is a fantasy setting that I built years ago where there are no traditional D&D dragons. There's no red dragons and gold dragons and bronze dragons and blue dragons and whatever. This is really just dragons are sort of a giant reptile, very dinosaur-like in a certain way, and they're scaly, but they're brown scales. They don't really have a lot of like breath weapon variation. They can breathe certain things, usually fire or something like that. Very simple classical mythology dragons, but they're felt to be having been missing from the world for a while, and it's because they've separated themselves and gone into a sort of like a hellscape that they've cast themselves into, and they've left behind half dragons. So things like basilisks, hydras, cockatrices. These are mythological half-dragon creatures that exist in our mythology in the world. And I want them to be the dragon kind that are confronted as the big monsters, but also scheming to see if they can open the doorways to allow the full dragons back into the world. And so that's one of the settings. And that's very much like most traditional fantasy stories. It's very close to it. Very close to the traditional fantasy stories that exist out there. The second story that I want to lead to after that, and because that story has, the first story there has gateways to another realm in them, that is potentially what I'm going to have be part of the story, where characters interact and go on certain quests and try to level up to a point where they're getting some of their divine energy back, and then they pass again. So that other realm that they travel into may be hell instead of heaven. And as they're passing through hell, again, the 15 minutes it takes them to find the next gate may be weeks, months, or even a few years on the middle realms. And the world they land in is going to be the Satyr Cyclops realm that I think I maybe referenced once before, where instead of using dwarves and elves, the elves live in forests and are very nature-based, and satyrs could fill that role. And the Cyclops were assistants to Hephaestus, forging the tools and weapons of the gods. So they make a natural attempt at dwarves in a different sense in those roles. The character flavor of them has to be distinctly their own. They can't be just reskinned dwarves and reskinned elves. But that overall theme of a technological industrial society and a nature-based society is common in a lot of fantasy stories. We're just used to doing it with dwarves and elves, or gnomes and other entities. And so using the satyr and the cyclops as the two races, having the characters land on that world, and that world is set up in a situation that's going to have a ruler who ruled over a peaceful sort of truce between the two sides, and potentially was themselves a sliver of a god, and that ruler has been killed. And so there's a quest on for people to claim. Basically, the way I wrote this story synopsis in the past was there's a ruler who's killed, and the announcing of the next ruler is decided by quest. You have to go on a quest and win the right to the kingdom, to rule over the kingdom. And that quest is, for sacred objects or to collect a certain number of things that'll actually manifest a benefit to the people that you will eventually make the choices for as ruler. And so anybody can compete to become king or queen or emperor or empress, however we want to frame that. Even the people who potentially assassinated the previous ruler. So there's this competition between former enemies who are in a truce and were ruled over in that truce by a ruler. Now there is no ruler over them, and so that truce may be breaking down. But at the same time, you have the assassins who actually are also involved in seeking to gain power for themselves and their own cause. And you might have other factions or other people looking to be the one to win this competition. I don't necessarily want my characters for this story, or the characters who are playing a role-playing game based off of this story, to be competing for that competition. I want it sort of to feel like they got there too late to be participants, maybe. I'm debating that, since the way that the competition is won, the crown is won, is by collecting all the pieces. Like, if they have the option to do that, the players should be able to achieve that. So I don't want to necessarily cut them off from that option, but I don't want it to be the main focus. The goal of that isn't to be the ruler, but to navigate the conflicts between the warring groups and the competing teams trying to seek that win, and find out some answers to some of the problems that are happening in that world at that time. Who killed the ruler? Maybe that needs to be solved. And then eventually the characters move on from there to another setting, which I'm calling the superheroic D&D setting. And that one's sort of a little darker, grittier type of setting of what would a world in D&D be like with superhero characters. And like realistically portrayed. Like superheroes in a realistic world are an inconvenient problem in a lot of ways. If you watch like the Avengers movie, like the sheer destruction of New York City during the first Avengers movie, like that has consequences. People's cars, homes, and businesses were destroyed. Family members and people they knew were lost. There are consequences to that rock'em sock'em battle scene that makes good superhero stories and great adventures, but there are consequences for months, if not years, of that kind of thing. And so having these powered individuals fighting battles, yes, they're stopping the evil, but that doesn't mean that the city isn't just buckling under the strain of those massive battles happening on their terrain. And so writing a story about that is one of the things I was looking to do at a point. Making a role-playing game that passes through and plays in that setting is one of the things I'm definitely doing for this series. And then the fourth one in the sequence, I have, I think, 8 more after this, but the fourth one in this sequence, I think, is going to be one we have to do, and then we get, like, after the fourth bit, you have to give them the chance to get back into the upper realm. It can't be just this long chain of Odysseus's quest before they get home. You have to give them the chance to get there and find things that makes them have to dip back out into the larger world again and again. So the fourth one in the sequence is the zombie apocalypse setting, and I've set that up. It's not really zombies. I've set that up to be more of a xenomorph from like the Aliens franchise. In a certain sense, like the Zerg from StarCraft or the Goa'uld from Stargate SG-1. So you have these parasitic, infective aliens that take over your body and turn you into monsters. And that setting is going to be very much like a post-apocalyptic zombie setting, in the sense that society has crumbled and it's fortresses of people living sort of like feeling like they're in a prison, and occasionally causes that require people to go out into the world full of these zombie monsters. And I think that setting as a D&D fantasy setting would be very interesting, because we're used to zombie movies being like, oh yeah, you shoot them in the head with a gun. What do you do if you don't have the guns? Like a crossbow bolt to the head, is that going to stop zombies the same way that a bullet through the cranium does? I don't know. Is that the way you have to kill them? Are these slightly different monsters? How does this work? The idea is that it's something that people get converted into, and you could be converted into too, at risk of an end game for you. So that one I feel is going to be really fun to role play in. I like the Satyr Cyclops one and the zombie apocalypse one specifically for their uniqueness. The superhero one is unique, but it's a little more high adventure and a lot less like intriguingly different. And then after that, potentially getting back into the heaven realm and having a twist on that battle happen that takes, again, that time difference is going to be an important factor. You know, an hour and a half up there fighting that battle before you're cast out again or have to leave to go back down to the main realms. that hour and a half could be decades of time. And so when you land back down, there are settings of things like society used to be large empires and there was a crash, and they're sort of the ruins, researching the ruins of former empires to claim things that benefit the cause that you're on. And then another one that's set up as a empire builders or changeover of empires. And then my Medusa setting, and then the dying world, where you get to a world where you really just have to accept the fact that, like, it's sort of like in modern times, if we really think about, like, well, climate change has gone to a point where it's going to run away and we can't stop it anymore. In 2 or 3 generations, there won't be a world anymore. And there's nothing we can do to reverse that process. So you prepare your children to be the third to last generation, and their children to be the second to last generation, and their children to be the last generation. And you just accept that, like, your fate is to die out as a species and as a world. What does that do to a world? And so that's one of the settings. And then potentially another reemergence into the divine realm, followed by another venture down into the setting I call Cast in Stone, where the novel I'm writing in that setting takes place far enough in the future that an order of monks who cast their souls into giant golems to fight against an invasion of demonic creatures is on the decline, and they've been forgotten. There hasn't been an invasion of demons in half a century, and so people have just assumed it's done, it's over. Nobody needs these people anymore, and so their order is dying out, and their traditions are dying out. There are fewer and fewer of them over time, and then another demonic incursion comes in. That's a novel I've been writing and for a long time. I've been outlining it. I haven't been writing particularly the story itself yet. But potentially the story I want to tell in that setting now is of that first order of monks casting their souls into stone bodies to battle against demonic incursions. And then the next one is Piecemeal, which is the story I talked about where people died out, but they created individual golems to replace them, to be their legacy in the realm. But these legacy golems, they may have the memories or the traditions or whatever, but they do not have the ability to produce another generation of them. And so cracking that riddle is important. And that one's important to do at a certain distance from the catastrophe that wipes out the people. But I'm not sure if I want to do that one partway to the actual overarching story of that setting, in which there is a character on a quest to benefit making future generations of their kinds. That story arc is a story that I've been outlining for years. But I'm not sure where to set the role-playing game story in there. Potentially just maybe in the middle. So the whole setting is a sense that there is no hope for another generation right now. And a question as to what happened that cost the entire world the creators of the golems. Where did they go? What happened to them? And so again, that's just another visited realm that I have as part of this story. And then I have more stories that I can make into settings to add on to this. But I think having that option is something I can do for the tabletop gaming. But And maybe potentially I can do a follow-up novel that follows up the characters that I'm running through this for the novel. And that depends on where I end the story. Do I end the story with the characters resolving the fight in the divine realm, or is this now something that's gone from a cold war to a hot war, and then it's just this guerrilla fighting throughout the lower realms as the conflict? And so future books would be the story of immortal godlings battling amongst the lower realms to secure whatever their cause is, either the cause of titans and chaos or the new gods reemerging from the shards of the shattered and killed gods. Like, do I want to make that a perpetuating, continuing story of world hopping? And how many realms do I want to do? So that's sort of like, for right now, settling on the first events of Godfall and the worlds they travel through, as I make characters to play through that storyline that can be stripped down again and made a playable game for other people. That's sort of what I'm doing right now. So that's sort of that is the condensed version at 37 minutes. It's world building that connects different worlds, which is, I guess I can only call it multiverse building. I don't know what else to call it. I could also call it a par for the course for me. I have a tendency to make things more complicated than they need to be. Why write one setting when you can write 13 of them? So that's what I'm working on, and that's where I am with some of this. I do think that, like, I spent some time yesterday and today trying to say, like, okay, setting 1 is going to be year 1 through 10. Setting 2 is going to be 10 through 20. And I looked at that and I said, that doesn't feel right. What it needs to feel like is not this, 10-year gap for each world. It's not like a stop, stay in this town for a year and move to the next town the next year kind of journey. That's not what I want it to do. What I want it to feel like is you land on a setting and there's certain things to learn on that setting. So one of the things I'm going to have happen is these shards of gods, these individuals who are now the egg of the next phoenix to rise from the ashes of the first god that fell. These shards have that spark, but that spark can be harvested by the enemy. So the titans can kill the shards of the gods and absorb their divinity to repower themselves. That's setting 1. Setting 2 is the realization that that divine spark, if done right, can be harvested by non-divine entities. So ordinary people who are not shards of a god, who are not titans, who are not angels or demons or any of those kinds of creatures, just a dirt farmer in the middle of nowhere, if they know what to do and they kill a divine spark carrying entity, they can absorb that and take on the potential of becoming a god themselves. And so that's what's happening on the Satyr Cyclops world. And the super heroic world is sort of a kind of exploration of the further implications of that. And then the zombie apocalypse world is an even further delve into the consequences of that fact, in which if you have a monster, just a baseline monster, It's sort of like a rabid grizzly bear. It's not a god or a demon or an angel or anything like that. If you just have a rabid grizzly bear, or in this case, the corrupted entities that are the zombie plague, if one of them absorbs a divine spark, do you get the start of a zombie god? And what does that mean? And then it's reclimbing into the divine realm and then coming back down to deal with the consequences that this battle in the divine realm have had on the worlds that you have been in. And then the perpetuation of that battle through a few other worlds, and then a decisive battle in the divine realm, followed by going back to worlds that are the cast in stone world and the world that died as a consequence of the actions of some of this conflict. The piecemeal, all the entities died. And so it's just sort of like, I think there's a way to string them together that's not like 10 years here, 10 years there. It's more about how long it takes to find and resolve the key factors of each world that have to play in the story of this divine conflict and its consequences on the mortal realms. And so some of those will be short stops. I feel like the super heroic world will be a short stop. Anyway, that's sort of where I am with this right now. I thought I'd take the chance to update. Last night I was going to try to do another episode of Black Mirror, but right when I got everything set up and was getting ready to go, a noise upon noise entered the house. And so I was unable to continue. And considering that it's now probably about 12:30, close to 12:30, I feel like we're right on the edge of when that time's going to hit again. So I may not get anything else done tonight, but I at least got the chance to do this tonight. I'm hoping to be able to do it at least a few more times this week. So probably tomorrow, hopefully Friday and Saturday as well. Sunday, I'm going to be doing some gaming with some friends. And so that timing might be a little bit off. And I might not even get the shot to do it. Because by the time I get back here, I may not have the quiet I need to do this. Anyway, I will try to do as much as I can each night this week. I'm excited to be back into doing this while I can. If only I could get the rest of my schedule to work with me. Thank you for joining me. I want to say take care and have a good night. And adios. I will catch you tomorrow.